Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's broadcast from the Marin Symphony. I'm Tod Brody, Executive Director of the Marin Symphony. And as you can see, we're doing things a little differently this week. For nearly 5 months now, our weekly broadcasts have consisted of Maestro Alasdair Neale in conversation with a whole variety of Marin Symphony musicians, occasionally guest artists, choral conductors, executive directors, and it's created an opportunity for you, our audience and patrons, to get to know these extremely accomplished and interesting people a little better. It's been very well received. We've gotten a lot of nice feedback, and we're looking forward to continuing this series for a long time to come. There is one person who's not only a Marin Symphony VIP, but maybe a Marin Symphony MVP, the person who most people think of first when they think of the Marin Symphony, and who hasn't yet been subjected to this interrogation, at least until now. So I'd like to welcome my guest for this week's episode, the esteemed music director of the Marin Symphony, also now its interrogator-in-chief, Maestro Alasdair Neale. Welcome, Alasdair.
Thank you, Todd, and I hope you'll go easy on me. I'm now quaking my boots. I think I might get a taste of my own medicine for the next few minutes.
Well, you will, and in fact, because I'm going to start, as you've started so many of these conversations, by asking you, how is life for you in the COVID era? How have you been spending your time, and how are you doing, Alasdair?
I'm doing fine, first and foremost. I certainly have been doing some things I never expected to over the last few months. Anybody that's been watching the last few weeks will know that I've been hosting from Sun Valley, where I was for 6 weeks in connection with the music festival there. I drove back through the hellscape of Idaho, Nevada, and Northern California over the weekend to get back to San Francisco, my home, and went through a very gray and smoky and unpleasant 12-hour drive there. But of course, I'm very happy to be home and resuming life, if one can say that. Certainly won't say getting back to normal, but getting used to a different rhythm than I had been over the last 3 months in particular, as things ramped up in Sun Valley.
Well, many of us have really enjoyed the Sun Valley broadcast, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that a bit later on. I thought it would be interesting, just because it's been so interesting to hear from your various guests in this series, as you've asked them about what you've come to call their musical origin stories. And I know people, me included, would love to hear your origin story, how music started for you. Was music important in your family as you were growing up, and how it all began?
Sure. Well, I like to say that music has always been part of the furniture for me, just as naturally as a sofa or footstool might be. It was the environment in which I grew up, near London, where I was born, and where I had music as part of my daily sound world. My mother, who is still with us, living in Edinburgh, and will no doubt be watching this, was by profession a music teacher, grade school music teacher. And she would always have Radio 3, which is the BBC's classical music channel, on in the background, as far as I can remember, for the whole of my life. So I grew up to the sounds of the world of classical music. So it was a very natural environment for me. And I started doing the usual things like playing recorder when I was, I don't know, about 6 or so. Actually kind of teaching myself to play piano. My mother was a pianist, but I never had any formal instruction. So I learned how to just to do the basics on piano. But my first real musical instrument was the flute, which I started when I was 9, and that was followed by the cello when I was 11. And by that time we had moved to Edinburgh, and that's where I grew up and where I had many of my first and most important musical opportunities, including my first conducting opportunity.
Well, I'm going to ask you to back up just a little bit and tell us, first of all, why the flute? What caused that to be your first orchestral instrument?
Very weird story attached to that. I should, by any stretch of the imagination, have been a violinist. So when I was 8, or I think I'm maybe just turning 9, at our local little public school where I went and where my mother actually taught music, we had the chance to get some free violin lessons. A violin teacher, was a peripatetic violin teacher, came round and was looking for students, I guess. And so we had aptitude tests, which first of all considered an ear training test, which, with not to be falsely modest, wasn't exactly terribly hard for me since I have perfect pitch. So you would have thought that since that was the main criterion that I would have just been selected, but they didn't choose me because as a kid I had the habit of just slightly distended finger like this because I used to gnaw on it. And so it was just slightly swollen. And for some reason, this violin teacher decided that I must have been my left hand, I guess, that it was too big for the violin, which is absolutely stupid when you consider some of the, I mean, you know, I was good friends of the family of Isaac Stern, and Mr. Stern and I knew each other fairly well. And I understood his fingers sort of weren't exactly svelte, you know. So by what logic that was arrived at, I have no idea, but it was patently absurd. So my parents said to me, well, you can't play the violin. What would you like to play? And I said, I don't know. How about the flute?
Okay. And
the cello came a little later because
I wanted to ask you about that too, because as a flutist, I've had a number of opportunities to put my hands on stringed instruments in my lifetime. And it's just such a different way of thinking about sound and of moving, and the physicality of it couldn't be more different. So then why the cello, and what was that like for you?
So when I went to high school in Edinburgh, and in the UK, you start high school earlier, basically 2 years later will be the equivalent of 7th grade. And it's a 6-year process rather than the 4-year one. But I got a scholarship to a local school that gave me free tuition on 2 instruments. So essentially, I got to take up a second instrument for free. And they even provided the cello. So I can't remember why I thought particularly cello by that stage, but I definitely knew that I wanted to play a string instrument. And I'm incredibly glad that I had that opportunity, because as it turns out, as a conductor, I think it's at least as valuable a knowledge base to have as a wind instrument. I'm actually really glad that I have a foot in both camps, and orchestral experience in both. Even though that I wasn't really very good cellist, I spread myself a little thin in that regard. I just couldn't, with all the other things that were going on in my life at that stage, I wasn't exactly able to devote, 5 hours a day to each instrument. But nonetheless, I have a sense of what the instrument felt like in my hand, to know that the method of sound production, which is essentially a horizontal method of making music rather than the vertical one, which a lot of conductors have because they're pianists. I like to think that it's at least as valuable as anything else that I had. Sure.
And then when did conducting come into your life for the first time?
Absurdly young, I would say. Composition came first. I started composing when I was 12. And I remember writing a little piece for my high school orchestra and choir. I must have been all of 3-4 minutes long, but somehow or other I cranked out some terribly derivative piece. But nonetheless, I got something done. And I realized in retrospect, what I was really interested in is getting underneath the hood and seeing how everything was put together. It started first in terms of compositional anatomy, but it also very shortly after, and I guess in a related way, it spread to the orchestra as well. I began to teach myself how to read scores, how to transpose, not with any specific goal in mind. I have to say, it was not step one of the master plan to become the maestro. That was never in my mind, it sounds incredibly naive, but it's absolutely true. I was just interested. So with my pocket money, I would start buying some LPs, and I would check out miniature scores from the local music library in Edinburgh and start to smash them around on the piano. And by that time, I'd actually joined a little youth orchestra, which, truth being stranger than fiction often, was conducted by none other than the former music director of the San Francisco Opera, Donald Brunicles.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Yeah, you really can't make this stuff up. So Donald and I were even actually at the same high school, George Watson's College in Edinburgh. We didn't overlap because he's a little older than I am, but I joined this youth orchestra that he ran. And when I was 13, I think, and they knew that I was interested in those sorts of things. So one day when I was 14, they asked me to take a sectional, the woodwinds. And so that was the first time I'd actually waved my arms in front of everybody. And it was a horrible experience.
Why was it horrible?
Well, it was completely intimidating. Everybody else in the section was older than me. It had already been rehearsed to death. It was Nielsen's First Symphony, if you can believe that. A very weird piece to start with. But I felt that I didn't have anything to say, and I was probably a little tongue-tied and not exactly brimming with self-confidence. So I sort of chalked that one up to, well, I guess I tried that. We won't be doing that anytime soon again.
So it sounds as though conducting began as a labor of love, wanting to understand how things worked, and then that initial experience, how did then that end up becoming a career path? I mean, I know that it's probably a complicated answer, but let us know how, when you knew that music was going to be what you built your life around, and how conducting was the focus of that.
Well, those are two separate things. And the first thing was a very much a bolt from the blue, as it were, the decision to become a musician. And that was my joining the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain when I was 15. Until then, I really hadn't thought too much about what I wanted to do with my life. I probably was thinking about a career involving languages, which have always interested me. But it was joining the National Youth Orchestra and going to that first rehearsal that I realized, oh, this is going to be my life. Absolutely, there's no question of it anymore. But at that point, I certainly didn't think of myself as a conductor in training. I just knew that it had to be music.
And it wasn't as a flutist? As a flutist in the orchestra?
Not necessarily, no. I again, it sounds terribly inchoate in a word, in a way, because I hadn't decided to be a flutist or conductor or anything. I just knew I was going to be a musician. And it wasn't until my last year at Cambridge that I settled on being a conductor. It was more or less when I had to make the choice. But until that point, there was no master plan at all.
Well, it sounds like it went the way it was meant to go. That's good. I know there's so much more we could talk about in terms of how that developed for you. And I know you then later came to the U.S. to be a student at Yale. Was that the reason for coming to the U.S., was to study at Yale?
It was specifically to study with the teacher there at the time, Otto Werner Müller, who had been recommended to me by one of my good friends at Cambridge, who himself had gone on to study cello at Yale. And he wrote to me and said, you really should audition for the conducting program here. There's this teacher from Germany originally called Otto Werner Müller, and he's really fantastic. And so I took my friend at his word, because my friend was had very exacting standards. So if he said something was good, you could take it to the bank. I thought, well, in that case, it's worth getting on a plane and seeing where this all leads. And it led to things that I had not expected at the time.
Well, shifting gears a little, you've asked a number of our participants, we have so many musicians who play in multiple orchestras and they teach and have families and other interests, how they juggle those various complicated obligations. So Alasdair, with music directorships, not only here in Marin, but also your roles as music director of the Sun Valley Festival for many years, and more recently as music director of the New Haven Symphony Orchestra, how do you make it all work? Not only the complicated calendar with rehearsals and performances, but all the other things that go into being a music director, the planning work, working with donors and staff and boards, learning your music, learning the scores. It sounds like an awful lot for one person.
Well, this has been a very interesting 12 months from a number of perspectives, not least of which is, of course, what happened in March. But by then, I'm happy to say that what was in many ways a test year had been working out very well. That is to say that there was no question that I had a little bit of trepidation of how my life was going to feel when I'm trying to balance these three orchestras, sometimes simultaneously. But to go back to the very end of your question, one of the reasons that I think I'm able to do that, you talked about the learning the music, it goes back to when I was 12 and 13 and 14. And what I was doing then, by checking out scores from the library in Edinburgh, by using my pocket money to buy recordings, I had no idea, but it was actually an investment in the future, because I was learning the basics of the repertoire at an age where they absolutely stuck in my head. I think most of us are like that. We realize that when we're learning things at 13, 14, 15, 16, that we can pull those back from our brains much easier than something we learned for the first time a couple of weeks before that. So in other words, I'm not reinventing the wheel every time. When I sat down, let's say this fall, in New Haven, I did Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Well, the first time I conducted that, I was 16.
Okay.
And the first time I studied that, I was probably 13. And so I didn't have to sit down and crack the score and say, well, I wonder how Beethoven's Seventh Symphony goes. That's not to say that I didn't crack the score open and didn't learn a fair amount about it anew, but nonetheless, the basic work had been done decades ago. And so I feel that what you can never be prepared for as music director is just how much time is involved doing things other than waving my hands on the podium. All of the behind the scenes work, whether it's development, PR, strategizing, meetings, all of these things, they take up time. And it can be very dangerous, I think, for a young conductor to be taking on too much at once and then finding themselves caught short sometimes, where the place that it matters more than anywhere else is when you're standing on a podium in front of the orchestra. Because an orchestra will sniff out in no time flat if the conductor's faking. Yeah. They know more than anybody else, and they can spot it a mile off. So I never wanted to find myself in that position. So in other words, I guess I had gotten used to the new rhythm until March hit. And I'd hope once we get back to normal that I'd be able to pick up the thread and keep that going.
Well, someone suggested a question for me to ask you, and it plays into something that you just spoke about, which was talking about conducting a piece like Beethoven 7 that's been part of your life since you were a child. And so you're coming back to that as informed by a lifetime almost of knowledge of that work. But so my question, and I'll get to the suggested question, but my question is, how do you find your approach or your sense of something, an old friend like Beethoven 7, changing over time? What's different about that? I mean, clearly you're that much more experienced, but anything you notice that coming back to an old friend like Beethoven 7 that feels different than maybe it did 20 or 30 years ago?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think maybe the changes are more incremental with a piece like the Seventh, which I feel comfortable with. It's been in my bones for a long time, as opposed to something like the Ninth, where I've never yet found a level of comfort. Okay. I've never yet been satisfied with a performance. And so I feel, while I feel my level of ignorance is, I find it much more piercing with a piece like the Ninth than I do the Seventh. I'm much more conscious of what I don't know and what I'm not sure about. Whereas the Seventh, and a few other Beethoven symphonies seem to sit a little bit more easily with me. Nonetheless, there are plenty of details that I come back on each time that I look at it again that I wasn't aware of before. You know, something really important happened to me about 4 years ago, and it was concerning Sun Valley. And I did, at the end of the season, so this would have been 2016, Mahler's Third Symphony, which is probably the longest symphony in the standard repertoire, and a piece that I vaguely knew. I mean, I'd heard it a few times, but I was really not that familiar with it. And I started the learning process in earnest in October. And between that October and August of the following season, when I conducted it, I studied it with the exception of maybe 6 days, every single day, sometimes only 10 minutes and sometimes 5 hours. But what I learned during that obsessive study period was really, really getting to know a piece in an almost instrument by instrument, note by note way. It was an all-in proposition. And what that taught me was, even amongst pieces that I think that I knew really well, on a certain level, my knowledge was superficial. So I unintentionally raised the bar for myself of what it really means to study a score.
That's so interesting. Well, that plays actually right into the question that one of our Marin Symphony colleagues suggested I ask you. And those of us that pay attention notice that from time to time you conduct performances from memory as opposed to from score. And just wondering, you know, aside from your confidence that you remember it well enough to be able to do that, what would go into the decision on your part to conduct a particular performance from memory, and what advantage would that bring once you'd made that decision?
Yeah, I'm embarrassingly inconsistent in my actions there. Sometimes I will do a piece from memory and sometimes I won't. And there are certain things that, there's an unwritten rule of etiquette for a conductor that one conducts a concerto with a score, because you're there to help the soloist. And the last thing you want to do is make a mistake and therefore ruin the soloist's performance. I think my rule of thumb for conducting from memory is it's akin to the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. And so I have to have a level of confidence in that I can deal with anything that might come my way. And the fact that I don't have a score there should not interfere with it. So for instance, if I am intending on doing something from memory, I will do the first run through, the first rehearsal without a score. So I never use the rehearsal period as a means of honing my memory. If I'm not ready on the first rehearsal, on the first downbeat to do it from memory, I won't do that. I mean, it does focus the mind, and it forces you to learn it as thoroughly as you possibly can. There are no shortcuts. And so I feel an extra degree of intensity often when I'm conducting from memory. So that's the advantage, that it's an all-in kind of thing. And honestly, then if you were to take that philosophically, then I should do absolutely everything from memory, right? Even a complicated modern piece with multiple meter changes. So guilty as charged. I'm not equally confident and equally prepared and equally at every single level of detail for every single performance that I do.
Well, that's the human element, but it's interesting to hear what the calculations are and how you think about that. So one last question, Alasdair. When orchestras return to the stage in the future, in other words, aside from that fact itself, what's on your wish list? Are there, for example, are there pieces that you've always wanted to conduct and haven't had a chance to do yet? Wondering just if there's any specifics about how you're thinking of your future career, and you know, anything on your wish list.
I'm not much of a planner. You might have gleaned that from what I was talking about earlier in my youth. I've never subscribed to the idea of, I've got to have a 10-year plan. By this thing I need to do this, by this date I need to do this. Maybe it's just sort of a little bit laissez-faire.
Well, the reason I asked, I'm going to interrupt just because the reason I asked is that we had planned for this season a Schumann Symphony. And you told me, and I was surprised to hear it, that you've not conducted a Schumann Symphony before. And we're looking forward to this being your first. And I would expect probably the first of many, but wondered if there were other pieces on that list that for whatever reason you hadn't gotten around to yet or weren't ready for yet, or just one of those curiosities.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Schumann, it's because I haven't felt ready for it yet. And believe me, I absolutely love Schumann. I know the vocal music very well. I studied it while I was studying voice at Yale, and a lot of the piano music as well. I just adore Schumann, but I've never felt that I had a window into the symphonies. And so I was looking forward to conducting the runners this season. So yeah, that will, whenever we are able to put that back on the docket, that will be a priority. I haven't lost my interest in doing that. I've been fortunate enough to conduct so much of the repertoire that there aren't too many things that are one would consider standard normal repertoire that I haven't had the chance to conduct that I would want to conduct. Perhaps some late Bruckner, the Ninth Symphony, a Mahler Ninth Symphony as well. Those are two big ones that I haven't yet gotten my teeth into, but those have complications of their own. I'm not quite sure how practical that is in some ways.
Well, Alasdair, thank you so much for letting me turn the tables on you. It's been so interesting to get a little bit more of your inside story and your thoughts. We could go on for a long time, I know, but I think we'll leave it at this. Looking forward to this series continuing, and even more looking forward to the orchestra getting back to business as soon as we possibly can. So thank you again. Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be in a different role, perhaps my more usual role. But it's been great chatting with you, and I want to echo that sentiment about wanting to get back. We all do. We just have to be very patient in the meantime, and I want to thank you for all your help and support in that regard. Well, we'll see you soon. Take care, and to be continued. Okay. Yep. Talk soon. Yeah. Thanks.